Disclaimer, I do not own anything being shown in this video. So I just saw James Gunn's, what would be some kinda The Suicide Squad, and it is unapologetically one of the most visceral, raw, and purest comic book adaptations of all time, without question. Not only does it do a great job of bringing these mostly Z-list characters to life, but it keeps you guessing as to which of them will survive. James Gunn did not lie in that aspect of the film, so I'll just warn you all right now that this video will indeed be filled with spoilers. I repeat, if you do not want to be spoiled, please watch the movie first and come back later. One of my biggest problems with the first film was that despite having a pretty big ensemble cast, I didn't really get a sense of danger for any of these characters because the film wanted to focus more on making these bad guys redeemable instead of just embracing them being full-on villains. By giving them all a quirk that shows that they're bad guys, but they're not really bad guys, made them all, I guess, likable? Is that the word I want to use? Because I really don't want to, because none of them are really that likable, because they're pretty bad.
I can't wait to show you my toys.
In other words, it felt pretty clear that they want to make a Guardians of the Galaxy and Deadpool movie more than a DC villain team-up film. Now that isn't to say having those arcs was the only thing that made that movie bad, because to be fair, The Suicide Squad does the same thing with some of their characters. But I feel the difference is that the 2016 film tried to make everyone go through the same arc, even adding cheesy lines about being a family, like,
I lost one family, I ain't gonna lose another one!
You barely knew each other for like a day, and now you're that close to each other? Like, come on, you may be bald, but you ain't no Dom Toretto, El Diablo. This time around, characters feel less like they're trying to be heroic and more like they're in survival mode. They still have their own motivations and personal objectives, but they clearly are doing everything they can to just barely make it out alive, even if it means having to get along with one another. I also appreciate that while this movie is rated R, it doesn't try to go the route of the DC animated films or Titans where they made them R just so they can be edgy for the sake of edgy. It helps make the characters feel more real and believable, and presents to us the level of danger these characters are really in, which is shown in that amazing opening sequence. This movie is violent and gory as hell, so to see so many possible main characters get demolished in the first 10 minutes was both hilarious and unexpected. I mean, it was pretty much expected that many of these characters weren't going to see the light of day, but to see basically 10 of them get brutally murdered in such quick succession was incredibly shocking. And again, did a really great job of putting us in their shoes and made us wondering who's gonna live and who's gonna die. Like, yeah, we knew Harley Quinn and Rick Flag were probably gonna make it, but I shit you not, people in our theater gasped when Captain Boomerang got killed. Yeah, you heard right. People gasped when Captain Boomerang got evaporated. And I think that's what really separates this film from Gunn's previous superhero films, the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. Those first two, while I do think are better films, the second one in particular, they have characters that you more or less relate to, and have more reason to be emotionally attached to all of them. The characters of the Suicide Squad, while less relatable, are put in such a dangerous situation that you can't help but root for them to make it out alive. And that danger is probably what makes this movie so special, and why it truly feels like a comic book come to life. Now I know this is going to seem out of nowhere, but just stick with me. I remember a while back watching the behind the scenes of Batman Forever, Batman and Robin, and listening to director Joel Schumacher talking about how the films themselves are comic books. No, that's not an error. He didn't say comic book films or superhero films. He called them comic books.
1,000 people worked on Batman Forever, and everybody, I think when you work on a comic book, a fantasy, it excites people because the reality police are not hanging around all the time, and you can encourage people's imagination, invention, spirit, humor. We tried to make a movie with a lot of humor in it, and but with a story underneath,
Now, don't get me wrong, I love the guy. He seemed like such a sweet person and ultimately just made the movies that the studio wanted him to make, but I think everyone can agree that he didn't quite understand what he meant by those words. What makes his Batman movies, well, pretty darn bad?
What killed the dinosaurs? Ice Age!
It wasn't just necessarily the big neon look to everything or the nipples on the bat suit, which honestly people just need to calm the fuck down about. It's mainly that they felt less like a comic book come to life and more of a Saturday morning cartoon from like the 60s come to life. I always appreciated the look he was trying to go for, but the way everything was so exaggerated and cartoony made it so hard to take the film seriously when they were genuinely trying to be serious. However, the Suicide Squad does the complete opposite of that approach. It more or less goes the same route as the 1960s Adam West Batman show. Now before I get comments being like, "What the fuck are you talking about? How dare you compare this masterpiece of a film to that old trash?" Just allow me to explain myself. I loved the Adam West Batman show, particularly the movie growing up, because while it is campy and clearly not taking itself seriously, the actors and the people behind the scenes clearly cared enough and put in enough effort to have the show feel almost exactly like the Batman comics at the time, which were pretty darn goofy and silly. But if that's too much of an exaggerated example, then how about Batman the Brave and the Bold? If you've seen this show, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, it's a show that has Batman teaming up with lesser known heroes going on crazy adventures while for the most part being serious. It does a beautiful job of adapting the wacky and zany Silver Age of comics, even from time to time adapting those stories. I bring this up because whenever James Gunn was asked if this film was a direct sequel to the first film, he always gave the same answer.
And I said, I don't think of this movie so much as an adaptation of your comics. I think of this movie as a sequel to your comics, to your run in the comic books. What would John Ostrander be doing with these characters, if it was 30 years after he first started?
And while that may feel like a slap in the face to the hashtag release the Ayer cut type fans, it is the perfect way of summarizing how this movie is. A continuation of the original comics. Everything from the laughable powers of the main characters to the nearly comic accurate and colorful costumes of Peacemaker, Ratcatcher, and Polka Dot Man, touches like these make the movie feel like a genuine continuation of the original Suicide Squad stories, specifically by John Ostrander, who actually makes an appearance in the film, which is a nice touch. I also appreciate that James really did go out of his way to find characters that, on the one hand, all seem equally as dumb and ridiculous, but also giving the spotlight to some of them that would be more fun to play with. Like any one of the characters who got killed early could have easily been part of the main group, and I feel we would have had just as good of a movie. Like, come on, don't lie and say you didn't want to know more about Javelin or TDK, or wouldn't want to see the main group interact more with Captain Boomerang or Weasel.
I mean, he's not harmless, he's killed 27 children, but, we got him to, I think he's agreed to do this. Whatever the case, just everyone get in a position to drop.
But the main cast that we did get were all very interesting and unique enough that I was more than satisfied that these were the people we got to stick around with. For me, David Dastmalchian as Polka Dot Man and John Cena as Peacemaker were the biggest new highlights. David did such a great job of elevating this character to be both equally funny and tragic, and I still can't get over how they managed to make his suit actually kinda cool looking.
I don't like to kill people, but if I pretend they're my mom, it's easy. I turned them into my mother in my head and killed them.
And John Cena absolutely crushes it as Peacemaker, perfectly playing this very serious character who would do anything to accomplish his goal, while also giving him some more human moments.
You laughing at me for, man? Why the fuck are you in your underwear? Tighty whities? Really? Now that's just racist. No, that's a show off.
Unless what they're showing off is dope as fuck.
Fuck. That's true.
The only complaint I have with him is that I wish he got to interact with the group more. I know James said he wrote the role originally for Dave Bautista, which does make sense because Peacemaker does kind of feel like the Drax of the group. I think he would have done a good job, but John is still the better casting, and I'm glad we got to see him in this role. Not to mention watching him in all the press releases wearing the Peacemaker outfit is such a joy. I genuinely cannot wait to see this show coming up. It's gonna be fantastic. All the other characters are great too, like King Shark being this adorable but violent goofball.
New dumb friends.
And Ratcatcher having a great emotional backstory and essentially being the heart of this film. It almost makes you wish she was the main character.
Is that rat waving at me?
I'm only saying this because I would say the weakest one out of the group would probably be Bloodsport. But even then, I don't think he's terrible at all. It's just by comparison, he kind of has the least interesting backstory and motivation, and it probably is just because his character does feel very similar to Deadshot in the first film, so having our essentially main character being very similar to our last essentially main character wasn't all that engaging for me. But again, I do think this presented well enough in this film that I wouldn't call it horrible or just a straight ripoff. In fact, I would say this is a much better improvement over Deadshot. Like, I think Idris Elba definitely brings a better dimension to it and gives a much better performance than Will Smith.
It's embarrassing!
No, what's fucking embarrassing is having you as my father!
Meanwhile,
Mama says I can't live with you because you kill people.
That's not true. That's a lie. She's lying to you.
I do also want to give praise to all the returning characters as well, who are much, much better than they were in the first film. Viola Davis, of course, is perfect as Amanda Waller.
I'm protecting this country. Everyone stand down.
Miss Waller, I don't—
Stand down!
Joel Kinnaman as Rick Flag I thought was so much better this time around, being the most normal and generally only good person on the squad, as opposed to just generic white guy from the previous film.
These guys, they're fucking idiots.
And of course, Margot Robbie as Harley Quinn still remains as one of the best castings of a comic book character to date, up there with J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson and Christopher Reeves as Superman. Like, I genuinely cannot imagine who else could possibly be playing this character but her. But oddly enough, she is kind of where I have one of my only problems with the film, which we'll now get into more of the critical side of things. While I do think The Suicide Squad is a perfect comic book film come to life, I do have some little gripes with it as a movie. But again, I do want to preface this by saying that it's mainly my opinion. If you don't feel these bother you, then by all means, I don't know, call me an idiot in a comment or something. I really don't care. My biggest gripe is probably the Harley Quinn and President scene, which I feel drags the movie down a bit in its pacing. Now don't get me wrong, I don't think this scene is terrible at all. In fact, I actually kind of like this scene. It feels like a genuine continuation of Harley's arc from Birds of Prey, which I do appreciate because it does feel like Harley is the only DCEU character who goes through a multi-film arc. My problem is that the scene just feels like it belongs in a different movie. This scene was the only one where I kind of felt the time going by and wanted to keep things moving along so we could get back to the other characters. I don't know, I think the placement of it isn't quite right, mainly just because the scene starts to slow down and starts to take its time, that when it ends and we get back to the main cast, it feels like their slow down scene at the bar is about to start. And for me, that's when the middle of the movie kind of starts to drag. Maybe I'm just being nitpicky and I doubt a lot of people are going to have this problem, but I don't know, it's just something that kind of bothered me. If it didn't bother you, that's completely fine. But other than that, it was still pretty good.
What kinds of dicks would find that? Don't they know how awesome you are? Have you shown them the birdies?
But it also does have this problem I had with The Last Jedi, where it's a scene that ultimately doesn't matter, and if you cut it out of the film, the plot would not change at all. In the end, Harley still gets captured again and has to escape. The only difference is now being that the mean general man is now president and Harley's wearing a different outfit, which kinda sucks because her first outfit in the beginning is probably my favorite costume she's worn, but thankfully it leads into the best action scene in the whole movie of Harley just clearing that hallway of dudes, so I guess that does make up for it. If I had any other gripes, it's that this film, more so than any other DCU films, does kind of feel the most like an MCU film, which I know isn't surprising because it's James Gunn and even some actors from the Guardians films is in this as well. What I mean is that despite it being very different from Guardians and Avengers, I can't help but notice some of these characters are just kind of extreme variations of the Guardians themselves. I mean, you got your character who has the tragic loving dead parent backstory who is also the emotional core of the film, an acrobatic ass-kicking skin-pigmented lady who kills a giant monster with a pointy weapon, a character who has a bad outlook on life for being experimented on, and is quiet and reserved while having a power that people in the film claim to sound super dumb, but in fact is the most useful power of all and gains much joy when feeling useful, an adorable big-eyed creature who's both sweet and violent that easily sells the most merchandise, and even a former wrestler turned actor who plays a dumb brute who takes things very seriously that gets a kick out of violence. Now before you all go off in the comments complaining, I just want to preference that this is something that I noticed while watching the film and was just a fun observation that I thought about. I don't mind that these characters have similar roles or have similar personalities because the actors and the characters themselves bring enough to the table to tell that there is clear distinction between each of the characters. Again, it was just a fun observation that I saw. The only time I ever went, come on, really, was this moment.
Now it! Monster is Num Num! Monster Num Num? Yes!
Hulk. Smash.
I don't know if this was a nod or something, but it was the only bit that really took me out of the film. And again, these aren't major criticisms, but more so things I noticed that made me feel like the movie was kind of towing the line a bit between a Suicide Squad film and an MCU film or a Harley Quinn film. It's been said that comic book movies and superhero films are starting to get stale and will eventually end up like westerns and just start to die out. And while at the moment I don't feel this to be true, it is something I fear could happen one day. I hope more comic book movies start to take notes from this and really start to go all out and embrace what makes comic books so special. It isn't just about trying to be cool and edgy and hip with the kids and trying to get every demographic possible to see these films. It's about embracing the overall silliness of these stories and characters while also treating the material with the just right amount of respect that anyone from any background can connect with it. It's a thing we're slowly starting to see Marvel doing with shows like WandaVision and Loki that I hope we continue to see more of down the road. As long as you keep things simple enough and have each character be identifiable or relatable, it doesn't matter how much crazy shit you put in your movie. I mean, can you imagine around the time of Man of Steel that 8 years from then, we get a movie that has Starro the Conqueror existing in the same universe? Like, that's insane to me.
Pablo! You see who that is? Huh? It's your mom!
Some of my favorite movies of all time include the likes of Logan, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Avengers Endgame, and The Dark Knight. And despite all of them being comic book movies, each feels so distinct from one another that they're basically different genres, and the Suicide Squad continues that same idea. I'm also glad DC is finally getting out of this rut of just making things dark and real because the Dark Knight trilogy made the most money and they want to be different than Marvel but also want to be like Marvel and be pissed when one of their movies don't make $1 billion. Like, that's the standard now for comic book movies. They appear to at least be heading in the somewhat right direction for future installments by just having each movie be their own thing. If they connect to each other, then they'll say so, and if they don't, then they don't. I do appreciate they're genuinely trying to do different things for each film, and actually letting the directors tell the stories they want to tell with these characters. Well, for the most part anyway. Kinda. A little bit? Okay, not really. Again, while I do have some gripes with it, I'm not at all surprised this movie's getting 10 out of 10s and perfect scores because I think it does deserve the praise. For me, it more or less falls in line with the first Guardians of the Galaxy film. That being, I understand why many people love that film, but for me, I really do like it and I really do enjoy it, but I'm unfortunately not among the masses where I'm just overall praising it and think it's one of the best of all time. But if you think of it that way, that's great. If you're a fan of comic books and especially comic book movies and want to see more variety and keep the genre alive, please go support this movie. It's a genuinely fun movie that I'm sure you'll at least get some enjoyment out of. Thank you for watching, everyone. This is my first video essay, so I hope you enjoy what I had to say, and I want to hear your thoughts down below. If you'd like to hear more of my thoughts of this movie, I have a podcast with my girlfriend where we go more in depth with it, and I'll leave a link in the description or on the screen somewhere. If you'd like to see more, again, let me know in the comments below, and please like and subscribe, I guess. Thanks again, guys, have a good day, and remember to stay safe out there.